I'm Alice Rivlin. I'm the director of the Engelberg Center for Healthcare Reform here at Brookings, and I would like to welcome you most warmly on behalf of Brookings, on behalf of the Economic Studies program, which we're part of, and especially on behalf of the Engelberg Center. We have a lot of things going on at the Engelberg Center. We talk about serious stuff like payment reform and how to finance Medicare and Medicaid and a lot of stuff like that, which is very important. But the really exciting thing that are going to determine what healthcare is like in a few years are what you're going to talk about here today. It is innovation in many dimensions. How do we do it? How do we make it useful? And so I think this will be an exciting day. We've got a very good lineup, and I don't want to take up any more of your time. Let me turn it over to Mark McClellan.
Thanks, Alice, very much for that introduction. I'd like to welcome all of you who are here with us in the room and all of you who are joining us online for this morning's event on the state of biomedical innovation. This is the 2015 edition of our Biomedical Innovation Conference. Today's conference is part of a broad series of Brookings events, both here in on the broad range of issues related to biomedical innovation and specific topics. As Alice mentioned, this is a critical area for healthcare policy. Biomedical innovation has had a tremendous impact on the lives of Americans and people all around the world. Today, with over 700 drugs and biologics and thousands of medical devices and diagnostics in development, the potential for longer and better lives in the future is great. But the process of translating good ideas from basic science into safe and effective treatments that can improve people's lives can be long and difficult and uncertain. And the impact of new medical technologies on healthcare costs also remains a major concern. So to speed innovation and to maximize the value of innovation, our conferences and expert workshops have addressed a wide range of issues that affect drug and device development. These include topics like clinical trial design, expedited regulatory review pathways like the breakthrough designation, patient access to treatments in development, new reimbursement models intended to promote high-value innovation. But in addition to these specific topics, we've also periodically taken a big step back to reflect on the overall state of biomedical innovation and the most important opportunities to improve it. And that's what we're doing with today's conference, reflecting where we stand and where we're headed in successfully moving valuable new treatments from scientific discovery to access to patients who need them. Where have we made progress in recent years, and what can we learn from the recent developments in biomedical innovation? What are the most pressing challenges facing innovation in 2015? And what are the most important policy opportunities to accelerate progress that Congress, federal agencies, and the broader stakeholder community could consider and undertake? We're pleased to be joined for this conference today by leading experts in government, academia, industry, and patient advocacy groups for a productive exchange on these issues. We've got two major sessions in our conference. The first is an overview on recent trends in biomedical innovation and insights about important issues in biomedical innovations from a range of perspectives, including, again, patient advocates, government leaders, and private sector and academic leaders. Second, in the next session, we'll review some of the latest evidence on trends in biomedical innovation, along with how we can do a better job using that evidence to track innovation, to identify problems and promising developments, and to evaluate the impact of policy reforms and other steps intended to improve access to valuable new medical technologies. Before we get started, I just want to mention a few of our logistical issues. Today's event is public. Press are present. The event's being live webcast and recorded, so everything here today is on the record. For those of us who are joining online, slides are available as a PDF on the upper right-hand side of your screen. And if you'd like to revisit any part of our discussion today, This event will be archived in its entirety on the Brookings website. For the panelists in our second session, I want you to meet Serena Coates. Serena, say hi, up there in the front. She'll help us stay on schedule during that discussion. And we're going to have, for all of you who are here in the room, we're going to have opportunities to ask questions during each session. And if you have a question, we'll bring a microphone over to you to make sure everyone in the room and online can hear your question. So just to help us frame today a bit, I'd like to briefly highlight a few of the emerging issues in biomedical innovation that will come up in our discussions today. There's a lot going on in terms of biomedical innovation policy. The House and Senate are both undertaking bipartisan legislative processes on improving the research, development, and regulatory review process. The administration has proposed new biomedical research and development initiatives. Federal agencies are undertaking new initiatives related to fostering scientific advancement and promoting access to more effective and safer treatments. But I don't want to put too much emphasis on what is happening in the public policy area alone. One of the most notable trends in recent years, which I'm sure we'll discuss today, has involved more efforts led by patients and the broader stakeholder community to accelerate progress in access to innovative, valuable treatments. Creating opportunities for progress through public-private collaboration is becoming an increasingly important feature of biomedical innovation. So just to go over some of these pieces, since last year, the Energy and Commerce Committee of the House of Representatives, as many of you know, has been pursuing the 21st Century Cures Initiative. After almost a year of hearings, white papers, many efforts at stakeholder engagement, and other steps, the committee released almost 400 pages of legislative proposals early this year. The proposals cover a broad range of topics, such as possible pathways for expediting clinical development and FDA regulatory review, and initiatives to promote the development and use of better clinical and outcomes data throughout the life cycle of a product, and addressing some potential structural barriers to coverage of new medical technologies. Also notable in this effort was the number of proposals that involve public-private collaboration in one form or another to improve innovation. For example, some of the proposals involve multi-stakeholder collaborations for developing new tools like biomarkers and new methodologies to support research. Also, the proposals include emphasizing the patient voice during the clinical development and review process around outcomes, around risk-benefit assessments, and the like. Again, these are proposals that in many cases are based on promising efforts and initiatives that are underway now, but that could be accelerated. Chairman Upton from the Energy and Commerce Committee emphasized that these proposals are far from final, but are intended to be the basis for further discussion and refinement, and those that can get bipartisan support from the committee and can get to a level of specificity and practicality for implementation will move forward in legislation. So, not surprisingly, there have been a lot of comments and further discussions, and that's expected to lead to an updated set of proposals that will be released in the coming days. On the Senate side, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee has announced a process with work groups to examine a spectrum of medical product development and use issues to identify where new policy efforts could be beneficial. This is under the leadership of Chairman Alexander, Ranking Member Murray. The HELP Committee has established these bipartisan work groups and outlined a plan to introduce their own legislative proposals based on this process later on in 2015. And President Obama, in his budget announcement, has also described some targeted proposals for improving drug development. This includes additional funding for antimicrobial research and a precision medicine initiative that will involve support for a large cohort study to gather and analyze genetic and health data from perhaps 1 million Americans, as well as efforts to identify genetic markers across different types of disease areas like in cancers. I want to emphasize that not only do these potential federal policy initiatives reflect ideas from government, but also from ideas outside of government. So improvements in post-market data collection efforts on drugs and biologics today is leading to an enhanced potential for public health surveillance and research, and improved innovation through the Sentinel Initiative at FDA, as an example. This is an effort that's supported by the FDA, but conducted through a privately led collaboration involving health plans, healthcare organizations, and academic experts and industry. Efforts are also underway to begin active post-market surveillance of medical devices, enabled by the implementation of unique device identifiers, but once again through a collaboration between FDA and a range of organizations like health plans and healthcare providers, hospitals, others that can develop and maintain longitudinal data for tracking safety. It's another example of public-private collaboration to address some of the important gaps in biomedical innovation evidence. So these are examples of how collaborative efforts are underway, examples of how agencies in the federal government are working with the private sector to solve some innovation challenges. Now, our first panel is involved in a number of these efforts, both efforts underway in the federal government and efforts underway through the private sector and public-private collaborations to address challenges in biomedical innovation. And I think they're all here with us this morning, so I'd like to invite our first panel up onto the stage right now while I introduce them, and we're going to talk with them about some of these opportunities and some of what they see as the most important issues and developments in the biomedical innovation environment taking place right now. So throughout this discussion, we're going to hear a range of views and perspectives. We had originally, if you looked at your agenda before getting here, you saw that we had 4 panelists on the list. Unfortunately, despite all of the progress that has occurred in biomedical innovation, that hasn't yet extended to acute upper respiratory infections, so in some ways. So Dr. Pamela McInnes couldn't be with us today as she is under the weather. We hope she'll get well quickly. We're very pleased to have with us today Dr. Jeff Allen, the Executive Director of Friends of Cancer Research, Dr. Pamela Tinnerts, the Executive Director of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, and Dr. William Chen, Bill Chen, the Executive Vice President for Scientific and Regulatory Affairs at the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. So I'm going to come over there and join you for this discussion, but while I get mic'd up, let me go ahead and pose the first topic that we'd like to talk about this morning, and that's the clinical trial process. So this has been in the news a lot lately, both the importance of developing better evidence through clinical trials, as well as some of the challenges and costs of conduct of clinical trials, and some of the difficulty of enrolling patients and collecting relevant data. I think the upshot of all of that is that there's a lot of agreement that there are many opportunities to make the clinical trial process more efficient, but some challenges in getting there. On the other hand, I know many of you all have been involved in steps to try to improve the collection of data, the enrollment of patients, the conduct, the efficiency, the impact and the relevance of clinical trials. So I'd like to start off this topic with Pam, if you don't mind. Maybe you could give us a little bit of framing about some of the challenges and opportunities around the development and the conduct of clinical trials.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you for allowing us to be here today. It's exciting. It's an exciting time in biomedical innovation, and it's specifically exciting for us. We've been working on clinical trials for 20 years, and all of a sudden it's hip. So it's kind of cool that people are actually thinking about it and trying to really make clinical trials better. Some of the things that have come up, as you mentioned, are IRB issues, the use of a central IRB, and how some of the processes in clinical trials could potentially be improved to make things go faster, because the faster a clinical trial goes, the faster you'd have the evidence one way or another, and the faster it could get to patients, which is ultimately what we want. And what we looked at with the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative is why a single IRB of record was not used more often. Because at the time there had been indications that FDA and OHRP were in favor of this, and this is now a couple of years ago. This is more like 4 years ago when we started this. This is before all of the recent discussions have started. And what we did is we interviewed IRB administrators and institutional officials to ask them why is this not happening? Why are you not allowing, when a sponsor comes to you with the opportunity for a single IRB of record, why are you not allowing to have that happen? And what we found out through these interviews is that IRB administrators and institutional officials were confounding and combining into the IRB, local IRB review, institutional responsibilities as well as IRB responsibilities. So that when a sponsor would then come and say, hey, we've got this single IRB of record and everything will go faster, they did not want to give that up to that single IRB because they weren't sure how to deal with the institutional responsibilities anymore. So we created a document that specifically lined out what is an institution's responsibility, what is an IRB's responsibility, and what could be handled by both, so that when a next request comes, an institution could look at that and take care of their institutional responsibilities, but allow the single IRB of record to take care of those responsibilities. So those recommendations came out and included that you should use the considerations document to figure out how to parse things out, and that sponsors, when it's possible, that they should require the use of a single IRB of record. Because what we found too is that once an institution had used it, they were much more likely to use it again. So then we did a lot of presentations about this, and people would come up to us, and we launched a follow-on project because we said we still need more tools. Because if you use a single IRB of record, you need an IRB authorization agreement between your institution and that IRB, and what might that look like? And so we are about to come out in the next couple of weeks with recommendations and a template for an IRB authorization agreement, along with a couple more, I don't want to call them checklists because people stop thinking when there's a checklist, but a couple more documents that allow an institution to look at their, if they're ready to adopt a single IRB of record. Have sponsors give them some framework around how do you pick a single IRB of record, like who do you pick, because it doesn't have to be a commercial IRB. It could be an academic IRB or another IRB. And then for an IRB, a document to think about how they look at the institution that they would be covering now. So I think coming up with recommendations is not always enough. You need to give people the tools to create the change. And so some of these things are possible and can happen, but tools have to be created so that people can get there. Another thing that we've found is while some of this can potentially be legislated, a lot of stuff has been brought on by the clinical trial enterprise themselves. I mean, we've created a bunch of these problems ourselves. Typically, as an industry, when there was something that happened, we reacted with more forms, more things to be done, so that now clinical trials have become so complex. I mean, I'm sure you've heard about this. They're calling it like $2.6 billion to create a treatment. And a lot of that is because of complexity in clinical trials. People start thinking about to do a clinical trial and they add things on because they might be talking to a physician investigator who's interested in something particular. So while we're there, why won't we ask that too? And we'll ask that too. And studies have found that 20% of procedures in clinical trials do not tie back to an endpoint. I mean, that's an internal problem of our industry. We need to think about that and not do things in a clinical trial that don't add to anything, that are never used in the evidence later. And so our Quality by Design project is looking at how we can build quality in from the beginning so that we don't have, and how do we think smartly about clinical trials and just think frankly, like think about what it is you're trying to do and don't just do the things you've done in the past because they've worked. Those
sound like some very important initiatives. Let me just take a step back, Pam, if I could follow up a little bit about the IRB discussion. I mean, IRBs do play a critical role in clinical trials and overseeing the conduct of the trial and the ethical conduct in particular. But you talked about some of the obstacles to moving towards a more centralized IRB approach. Maybe just take a step back and think about why centralized IRBs might have advantages, especially for the larger multi-center trials that are becoming more common today.
So a central IRB would have an advantage because before you can start a trial, you have to have IRB approval, institutional review approval at all the institutions, which then takes care of making sure that the patient safety and integrity of the trial is taken care of. Typically now that if you have a trial with 20 sites, each of these sites has their own IRB. And as you can imagine, some of them meet monthly, some of them meet every 2 months. So the timeline of getting all these individual IRBs online and going takes a long time. So some institutions may have IRB approval in a month, others it may take 3 months because the IRB has questions, it goes back and forth. And a study cannot start until an IRB review has taken place. In our site metrics study, we found that sites that actually use a single IRB of record, a central IRB, the IRB approval was more streamlined. it happened faster for those sites, and they actually enroll their patients faster. So all these steps have to be taken before a patient can be enrolled. And if we can streamline that process through central IRBs, that obviously streamlines the whole process down the road.
So in this discussion about quality by design in the clinical trial process that CTTI has undertaken, and these examples around making the IRB process work more efficiently and effectively, you are trying to get at some of these cost barriers and avoidable costs and time delays in clinical trials. Bill, can I turn to you in terms of maybe give us a little bit more context on what you see from a research and development industry perspective as some of the challenges related to clinical trial implementation and just how important these kinds of initiatives are.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me and us. I think this is a very important discussion. We all are dedicated to understanding how we can make better medicines more efficiently and effectively. I think we're all here to try to advance, to at least endorse policies that advance biopharmaceutical science innovation, but also to improve our regulatory decision-making approaches. Clinical trials, as Pam has already indicated, is a key step, obviously, in determining whether potential new medicines are both effective and safe. And it's well known that the majority of the total cost in this system is embedded in this process. I think people have estimated up to 2/3 of the cost. So it is essential that we look harder and harder at the key impediments, hurdles, et cetera, that lead to a less efficient approach to clinical trials. Pam's talked about reliance IRBs, centralized IRBs. That's very important. I'd like to highlight maybe one or two areas. So a critical part of clinical trials is patient engagement and recruitment, and that is patient involvement in clinical trials. This is more of a challenge than you might imagine. In the United States, there is more and more problems in making patients aware of clinical trials, educating folks, but also engaging them and recruiting them to trials. It's particularly difficult among underrepresented minorities, so that it's significant that African Americans or Hispanic Americans are greatly underrepresented in trials. Why is this? In part, it's because of awareness, historical issues, but we have to do much better in this. Pharma, working with the National Minority Equality Forum, really has worked over the last year to begin a process of awareness called Amen. This provides more awareness for clinical trials, the importance thereof, and the importance of engagement really for family and loved ones. So that's one part of it. The other is, once you have raised awareness, how do you actually recruit patients, really encourage patients to participate? And I think there are a number of groups trying to do that as well. So that's one feature, and this is just we're only mentioning a few, right, Pam?
We could talk for hours.
Right, we could talk for hours on this. But the second one, comes from my own background. I am a physician scientist, faculty member at Harvard Medical School, where we spent a lot of time trying to understand how we can better train clinical scientists to be the ones who actually perform some of these studies. You may or may not know there's a dearth of such individuals in this country and around the world. How can we actually be capable of divining better clinical trial designs, thinking about all the problems and trying to solve them without that? And I think that's another issue, Mark, that we need to face from a policy perspective, training not only physicians, but also other scientists who are very interested in clinical medicine and clinical trials in order to make this happen.
Do you see any steps taking place now that are helping with that issue? I mean, you mentioned some of the initiatives related to education, outreach, encouragement of participation for underrepresented minorities in clinical trials. I'm wondering if there's similar efforts underway that you see as promising on the in the process of getting more expertise into conducting the trials.
Well, this is an ongoing challenge. You have young physicians and scientists wondering what kind of career do you have in this area. Physicians particularly have tremendous challenges in terms of their usual debt when they get to this point, and really having almost a seduction to go into practice rather than to go into this very, very important field. There are important steps, though, that have been made. I think the NIH with the Clinical Translational Science Awards, CTSAs, have sought to provide more funding to allow prospective clinical scientists to actually appreciate what this is all about, to actually have education in this. And I think we're slowly seeing some progress in this. I know that at Harvard there's a lot of activity, Duke and many other places. So I think this is hopeful, but I'm just worried that it may not be enough.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the patients who assume you'd like to get into trials are not necessarily going to Harvard or Duke or some of these major centers, but are out in the community, and that seems to be an especially important issue as trials aim to get more targeted around particular types of patients with genetic profiles or other characteristics that fit in with the pressure towards
Great
personalized
point,
medicine.
because I'll focus on patient awareness and engagement, and we talked about the physicians who do the trials. A critical part about this system are the healthcare providers. They also need to be part of the discussions and the decisions here. And we all fear that perhaps we're missing that part. That again, we talk about busy physicians who may not want to be clinical scientists. What about those physicians who have to take care of patients? And they spend endless hours doing that. And then now we're asking them to talk to patients about engaging in clinical trials. Many of them are not aware, and many of them don't have the time. How do we help physicians and healthcare professionals help us in this process as well?
Jeff, if I could turn to you on the same topic. This is cancer research is an area where there's a tremendous amount of activity going on now, both in terms of the range of therapies, not only traditional drugs or even more traditional biologics, immune therapies, other combination approaches that are being developed, increasing evidence that a patient's genetic profile really does matter. It's not just the type of cancer you get, but the metabolic profile and the pathways that are disrupted by the cancer. All of this suggests that having more and more targeted trials for cancer therapies would be really helpful, but as Janet Woodcock from FDA likes to point out, only a very small fraction of adults with cancer actually get into some kind of clinical trials. I know this has been an important issue for Friends of Cancer Research. How are we doing? Are we making progress?
Progress is slower than I think everyone in this room would like, but I think we're making progress in terms of looking at new approaches to address this problem. And specifically, what's happening in the field of oncology, at least in several different tumor types, is that as the underlying biology of the disease becomes better understood, as you said, it becomes evident that different targeted approaches to go after genetic alterations that are driving the cancerous growth can be positive interventions. But the challenge is that as you parse out these different genetic components, the populations that you test them in become smaller and smaller, and this puts additional stress on the system that has already been described here, both in terms of finding the patients, making sure that the trials are widely enough available because the patients are going to be spread much further in between. You may only have a couple of patients at any given institution that have a particular genetic alteration of interest for the drug that you're trying to test. So the system really needs to be flipped around. This is what we're trying to work on in a concept in lung cancer with regards to the Lung Cancer Master Protocol that was launched less than a year ago. And to kind of capitalize on some of the concepts that have already been raised, this was one of the first trials that utilized a centralized IRB that's being set up by the National Cancer Institute. And proof and concept here, to Pam's point, is what we were able to see in the LungMap study, which many of the institutions did utilize the NCI's centralized IRB, and they were able to get up and running much faster. Within a couple of months of the study, several hundred sites are open. It's now available in 42 states and well over 400 different sites that are able to offer this trial to patients. That doesn't alleviate all of the burdens here, but it speaks to the need for what is possible in terms of ramping up a trial. And to Bill's points of making sure that we have a system that more physicians can be involved in. To date, over half of the patients that have been enrolled in LungMap have been done through community-based setting rather than major academic institutions. So part of the problem here is availability. And I think that that's only one component, of making sure that we're able to address these challenges. But I think some of the unique properties of the LungMap study is that it's bringing innovative new technologies where they may not otherwise be accessible. So the concept of having genetic screening available at all of these different sites is relatively new, and I hope that drives participation in the trial. Because perhaps for some of the first time, some of these smaller facilities are able to utilize the biopsies they might be giving to lung cancer patients already, and there's a system in place now that they can get full genome sequencing through our partner in Foundation Medicine to be able to shuttle the patients to the most appropriate arm of the trial. And what this does is combine testing for multiple different drugs within the same protocol. And this is meant to evolve over time. So not only do you have the platform in place that you're screening patients to make sure they're getting the treatment that's best fit for them, the protocol is constructed in a way that new drugs can essentially plug in and plug out over time. So we're not going through this multi-year process of setting up a new protocol every time you find an interesting new drug to research. It essentially can just be folded into the protocol, and so long as the screening is continuing and providing patients and physicians the information about the genetic makeup of the tumors, then essentially the trial just keeps building and rolling along as the new drugs and biomarker pairs become available.
So this is the kind of the opposite of the one-off trial approach, where everybody gets together and builds an infrastructure to address one important question. This is really about a whole area of cancer therapy. And maybe you could say a little bit more about the patient population that's involved in this effort.
Right, so it is in squamous cell lung cancer, which is unfortunately one of the most deadly forms of lung cancer that to date hasn't necessarily had the same progress made in terms of biologically targeted agents as some other forms of lung cancer or melanoma or other diseases. But based on the Cancer Genome Atlas, it has become evident that many of these alterations that could be driving the cancer are present in squamous cell carcinoma of the lung. So in terms of identifying the patients that could be involved here, it's really based on that initial genetic screen, where there are several targeted arms in which a patient that is positive for one of these biomarker pairs is then shuttled into that arm. A unique feature of the LungMap also is the availability of a non-match arm. So if a patient is screened for the trial and doesn't match one of the currently available biomarker arms, there is one of these immunotherapies that you mentioned that is being tested in the context of this study. So there is an experimental drug essentially for everyone, which historically has been a concern in some clinical trials, that patients may feel like they're enrolling in a clinical trial for access to the experimental agent, but in many cases for the integrity of understanding what the contribution of that experimental agent is, randomization is necessary to occur. Now, in oncology, what this means is availability of standard of care versus the experimental arm, so it's not necessarily the historic concerns of placebos, so to speak. But the goal here is to rapidly test some of these targeted new agents in a way that wouldn't be able to be done without this type of construct. If going back to the idea of having to find the patients, some of the alterations that are being tested for in LungMap are very rare. When it's 5% of this population of lung cancer patients, even finding them would be very difficult and frankly increase the cost and time constraints on the trial because the screen failure rate, so to speak, you'd be 95 out of 100 patients may not be fit for the trial. By screening so many up front, you're able to capitalize on that information and not lose it. So the time component of LungMap as well as the cost are really a huge advancement here. It's estimated that the per patient cost for LungMap is well over half of what it would be to conduct this study or a traditional phase 3 study. So it's a huge positive, both from the efficiencies of starting the trial, getting the drugs in, getting the data you need to get them onto the market, but simply from an affordability standpoint in a environment where conducting these trials continues to rise.
I think that LungMap really, along with other studies similar to that, like I-SPY 2, really illustrates what we think we can do.
I-SPY, a set of studies for breast cancer to allow kind of ongoing multi-center enrollment and evolving treatment arms as knowledge improves.
In a sense, again, adaptive designs that in a sort of, if you look back a couple of decades ago, would not even have been considered, because the idea was you had to have randomized controlled studies with blinding, et cetera. And I think these experiments and pilots, in a sense, I think illustrate for us the possibility of streamlining, changing study designs that still get you answers quickly. We need to be challenged to continue to do this. And I think the other thing that's really wonderful about the work that Jeff and his colleagues have done is it's been done in collaboration with the FDA, with companies, and patient advocacy groups. So
and a large number of academic centers, oncology groups.
And that has really been sort of the newer trend in the last couple of years, I think, where people are seeing that if you work together, multi-stakeholder, everybody at the table as an equal partner, that you really do come up with better solutions, and that it helps the field. And sort of this isolation, is going away a little bit. And hopefully with some of these new initiatives, it's even going away further.
So this all sounds good, and clearly transforming the way clinical trials are being done in areas like breast cancer and squamous cell lung cancer through things like centralized IRBs that are well developed and consistently applied at all of the sites, steps that make it easier for community-based providers to participate, a broader range of treatment arms, which makes patients feel like they're getting plugged into a good system, steps to make more consistent and effective data collection take place. All that sounds good, but I have to say, from what I've seen of these efforts, they don't happen easily. So Laura Esserman, with the I-SPY efforts, kind of devoted her life to getting this together. Ellen Siegel, who has more energy than, as Jeff knows better than anyone, has more energy on trying to promote effective research than just about anyone I know, was spending most of that past year plus to help get this off the ground. There's a lot of willingness there, but these collaborations don't seem to happen quickly or easily. From what we've seen so far in these areas, what would it take to make this a more standard and replicable process for progress in clinical trials in a broader range of clinical areas? There's going to continue to be just a lot of hard work on disease area by disease area.
Yeah, I'd like to think that no doubt that projects like these could not have got up and running without the leadership of people like Ellen Siegel or Laura Esserman. And hopefully that was required so much in these two instances because they were both so new within the field. There has been, I think, following the lead of projects like I-SPY or LungMap, an increased interest in developing these types of clinical trial networks. It doesn't mean that it's inherently becomes easy, but at least there's a little bit of a model to follow. And from our experience, we certainly tried to learn as much as we could as those in I-SPY or the Battle Lung Cancer trial, a similar approach, had learned. We had some differences in lung map that still presented some new challenges, notably being that the design of lung map is one to be of registration quality, so that the drugs that succeed through this are fit for a regulatory decision at the end of the day, rather than just an exploratory type study. But I hope there are a lot of lessons learned. We certainly have talked to a lot of people in other disease sites that are working to replicate them. It's not a walk in the park, but I think as we get better at this and we understand how to collaborate better and understand what each organization and entity needs to put into these successful partnerships, hopefully they'll be able to become more routine and get up and running even faster than they have to date.
Basically, it's getting over it can't be done philosophy. And before these efforts, the wisdom at the time was it can't be done. And so having efforts like this move along and show progress suggests that, well, it can be done in some areas. So let's all challenge ourselves to think how it may be useful in other areas.
But the important part is too, as Jeff alluded to, is that people have to then also be transparent about how this came about, how this worked, what the problems were, so that you can actually learn from them. Because to just go ahead and do them and then never say a word about it doesn't help anybody, right? All has to be in the public domain so other people can learn. And you guys have done a fantastic job at that, speaking everywhere and letting people know about what the issues were, how you've overcome them, what you didn't overcome, so that other people can learn from it.
So making sure we capture the key elements of this process and get that out there. That seems like one important takeaway lesson for accelerating progress. Now, let me go back to some of my introductory comments about whether you all see any policy implications here, either in terms of legislative activities that groups like the Energy and Commerce and the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committees should be considering. I know there's some focusing on some efforts related to clinical trial improvement, or in terms of the other big issue, which is appropriation. So I know more money is better, but are there any implications here for how, say, NIH funding to support clinical research, or how company funding support clinical research should be directed?
Well, clearly, we need to do much more work in many of these areas. People always ever ask me, why isn't it easier to make medicines? We have all the technologies, we have many of the tools that weren't existent maybe even 10 years ago. How come it's still such a tedious and expensive process? And I think in large part it is still, the answer still is that disease is complex. We still don't understand what causes most diseases. Cancer is actually becoming more of an exception, amazingly, because of the great investment in our building of our knowledge in cancer over 40, 50 years. We also don't understand what causes the heterogeneity of disease. What makes an individual, two individuals with the same disease, manifest disease differently, how they respond to therapy, et cetera, and how they develop complications. So the point here is that we need more knowledge. We need more knowledge on the basic level. So that is NIH and groups like that. And certainly there is great interest in increasing the funding there. There is, however, we feel, important thing to remember is that it's not just about basic science. In order to make better medicines, we need to translate those ideas into reality, which is a form of a molecule or a device, et cetera. And that takes other groups like industry. I would argue very much that patient advocacy groups have to play a key role, academics play a key role. How do you bring all this together and not fund one versus the other? So we're in a difficult situation where, of course, NIH needs more funding. But if it's funding from other groups, then we feel then that would be missing the boat. You're taking funds from one pocket and sort of putting in the other, and that won't help the whole system.
So, I mean, I basically also agree that a lot of our basic science and people looking at science to evaluate it probably need more money. Where I disagree is I'm not sure that bringing more money to the specific clinical trial piece of it is what we need, because as Jeff said, the lung map study is actually eventually going to be a cheaper study per patient. So it doesn't always have to be more money. It's just thinking better about how we do some of the things. In clinical trials, I think sometimes it might be better to say, instead of 100 million, what if you had 50 million, what would you do? And you probably would get to a much more targeted outcome rather than more money.
Sounds like a good metric to track in terms of the efficiency of the trial. You know, what do you get in terms of enrollment, study completion, around meaningful endpoints for the dollars that are being spent? And I'm not sure that's something that we really track a lot. Jeff, what do you think most important for Congress and appropriators to be focusing on?
You know, the funding aspect I don't think can be understated, and I think one of the challenges with the annual budget cycle is that it's from a scientific perspective, while science itself moves fast, the process of start to beginning still seems kind of slow. But I think you know, where projects like LungMap can demonstrate what that process actually is pretty remarkable. You know, when you look at projects that are very early on basic research, things like the Cancer Genome Atlas, that when the NCI spearheaded that initiative several years ago, I'm confident they got a lot of pushback. You know, what is going to come from all of this data? Are we really going to get anything usable out of it? And, you know, and this is probably just scratching the surface as to what could come out of that data, but what the study team that has been leading LungMap was able to do is start to discern molecular targets in this type of cancer that drugs can be developed toward. You know, the hypothesis was based on some of those results from the Cancer Genome Atlas, very rapidly developing the drugs, matching them to the most promising targets, getting them in a study that is designed to be more efficient than just slowly walking your way toward data, but to really kind of jump in with 2 feet here and say, we have some early evidence. How do we design a study that's more efficient, that is in many ways for successful compounds combining the different phases of development, so we're getting to that point of regulatory decision much faster than the standard approach that has been applied thus far. And that's really been done out of careful design from the experts from the academic institutions, the National Cancer Institute, who has, you know, largely spearheaded this project, the FDA, who has been a huge willing partner to put their scientific expertise at the outset of this to help define how does the study need to be conducted so that the data that comes out of it is most usable for our intents and purposes. And, you know, it's taken everyone involved, you know, the companies, the academics, the advocates, the government, to start thinking about ways that they could do things differently. And oftentimes it's had to kind of push the envelope and bend things a little bit, you know. In order to put this study on a new trajectory, you know, even industry who operates from a business standpoint of doing things as efficiently as possible, you know, they had to think about ways to do things differently and do things even faster. And maybe that made people uncomfortable. You know, that's why we had people like Ellen Siegel to be able to drive these things forward. But at the end of the day, everyone was able to look at where they could make the steps that involved their individual organizations more efficient and faster, and the net gain has been huge.
There's a great discussion around clinical trials, where we are, some of the challenges, and where we're headed. Actually gives me some sense of real promise for the future, even though we're not all the way there yet. Despite all of this progress and potential future progress around better evidence from clinical trials, one of the biggest themes in recent years has been so-called real-world evidence, which seems like, it's a little bit hard for me to understand exactly what it is, but it seems like what it's not is evidence developed in well-designed, carefully controlled clinical trials, but evidence that's coming from elsewhere. And we hear about this a lot. So despite all this progress from clinical trials, Bill, I know you view this as an important area for further development for biomedical innovation as well. Can you say a little bit about why?
Sure, Mark. you protest that you don't know that much about real-world evidence, but you talked about
Well,
your
I was going
efforts
to define
in
it.
Sentinel
Sort of
and
define it
mini-Sentinel.
exactly.
Clearly, we have had a lot of experience using so-called unstructured or real-world evidence in helping us look at our medicines in terms of certainly safety from the Sentinel, mini-Sentinel perspective, the post-market surveillance aspect of it. Our question really is, what is the future role of such information? So I'm referring to information that's embedded in, for instance, electronic medical records, just as an example. How could we eventually develop the tools and the methods to utilize this information to complement regulatory decision-making? So that's just one question. Now, we realize that it might be early to ask that it replace it, for sure. But what we think is that it's necessary to take the steps to understand where it might play a role. And so it's very important to caution it's not a cure-all, so we're not saying that we're going to use this information to complement everything. But there may be specific diseases, conditions, patient subsets where this kind of information could be particularly useful. We like to say, after all, once the medicines are in the patient population, what we do is we gather real-world evidence. That information is not in the form of now randomized controlled studies anymore, and yet we have to make decisions about how useful those medicines are, continue to be, how safe they continue to be. So real-world evidence for us is just simply an area that we would urge all of us to be thinking about and exploring. It's here. All the data are here. Some would say there's too much data, but it also means that we should be actually encouraged to utilize studies, pilots, in order to learn the tools and the methods to be able to do this. Now, we know that real-world evidence has biases. We appreciate that. But how, despite that, can they be utilized?
So, I mean, the real-world evidence does seem to be getting additional attention and use. And Bill, you mentioned, you noted the regulatory uses, and FDA has expanded its Sentinel initiative activities and is now conducting studies on a regular basis that not only can help address issues that arise in the post-market setting, but that also can be part of the life cycle evaluation of a product, where there are questions that may come up in pre-market development that are just not feasible to address there because of sample size issues or questions about real-world use. Having an infrastructure in place to develop that evidence can help. Now, most of those regulatory uses seem to me to have been about safety questions, where these observational data, non-randomized data, are probably easiest to use when you're looking for something that just shouldn't happen, or just shouldn't happen very often, very rare events that are occurring more commonly, and things like that. So that makes it a good fit potentially for some safety questions. On the other hand, there has been a lot of interest, maybe not so much yet on the regulatory side, but certainly on the reimbursement side from payers, in really wanting to understand in the real world what kind of impact different clinical alternatives have in populations that may not have been exactly the same as those tested. We talked about minority populations not being well represented, elderly populations, and so forth, not having the payers feeling like they don't have quite the kind of evidence that they'd like on particular uses and in settings where things go wrong. Adherence might be an issue, where the treatment options maybe are more complicated with newer alternatives or suggestive evidence being developed that other treatments may be better or less costly. I haven't seen as much definitive work on what you might call the effectiveness or comparative effectiveness side using real-world evidence yet. that, though this is obviously a high priority for PCORI, for many of the payers, and I think increasingly for the manufacturers as well. So there is a question in here, which is maybe, I don't know if Bill, if you want to take this one, or Jeff or others, but where do you see this kind of evidence headed? I mean, it is a lot of potential there, but it seems like we're still a ways from really understanding how to develop and use these kinds of data effectively.
So with Citi, we're actually conducting a project in which we're looking at the Sentinel data set to see if we can use that set to identify patients for clinical trials, and then eventually to maybe see if you could use that set to sort of do a passive clinical trial to see what then happens to those trials. And we did a 1-year evaluation of what the issues could be and created a report. And then just this year, we've taken 2 use cases with inclusion-exclusion criteria and translated those into specifications that could be run through Sentinel to see if patients could be identified. I mean, there are some issues with that, of course, because if a company changes healthcare plan, a patient goes from one plan to the next, it's not exactly clear if you can link those two and things of that nature. But we have taken steps to see if there is a methodology that could be where you could repurpose the Mini-Sentinel safety system to sort of create clinical trials and see if that's possible. So we're definitely working on that. It's a work in progress and it's hard, but yeah.
Probably one limitation thus far has probably been the availability of some of these large data sets, and it requires them to be even more complex when you're looking at potential effectors of efficacy, so to speak. But perhaps this will move forward with the administration's proposal on collecting the genomes on 1 million Americans. I don't think it will reach the point of establishing clear causal effects between some of these factors, but having a database that is deep enough to collect genetic information could be a hypothesis-generating tool to then conduct different studies of responders and non-responders and start to try and parse out what factors might contribute to that better than what has been done in the post-market setting in the past. I think it's very complex, so you can't overestimate the importance of these data sets or the challenges associated with reaching a conclusion. But without it, we're kind of left in the status quo, which is sort of a bit of guesswork. At least in oncology, while we've painted a bit of a promising picture here in terms of new drugs that are having great effects, but very rarely are they across the board, and 100% of patients that take them see the response. So there's still a lot that needs to be understood about associated factors that that could be responsible for a response or a lack of response for many new treatments.
Mark, I agree with both Pam and Jeff that these are still early days. I think we look toward the experience of Sentinel, Mini-Sentinel, as a lead to potential success in trying to understand events, in this case safety, after approval. I don't think it's a real stretch of the imagination to think that we could be able to, or we should be able to capture information on benefit, on efficacy. We have to define it well, and of course, depending on the disease, that varies. I think the question for us is, there is a wealth of, and there will continue to be a wealth of data, let's say post-approval, post-market. Are we going to just ignore all that information from an efficacy perspective? Or will we be able to figure out how to use them in a good way? Just try to understand there will be biases. How do you sort of overcome those? And then allow that information to help complement, supplement the information that we get in the pre-approval process. I think I like to sort of quote Janet Woodcock when she says that when you gather all this information at the FDA and decide on whether a drug has sufficient benefit risk, it is in many ways still a prediction that this will more than likely be beneficial, outweighing risks. So it's a prediction. So how do you make that prediction become more real in time? You could mandate more studies, but we know that that's impractical. But if the data are there and we learned how to use those data, then perhaps they could help us.
I think it's going to become even more important because currently there's more and more devices and drugs being approved under accelerated pathways. So really you're even moving the lever forward a little bit with potentially, even less evidence in many ways, so that the post-marketing approval situation is going to have to be better understood. And I think not only is it sentinel initiatives or things like that, but registries. There's a lot of registries being created by patient advocacy groups, by professional organizations, and to leverage that in terms of getting evidence out of there, I think will be really important, and we really need to understand how to do that better.
So lots of opportunities for more data turning into potentially more real-world evidence, though some challenges that you've described in getting from the data to the evidence. I'd like to turn to another big theme that we've seen recently and that I know all of you have played a part in, and that's the increasing importance of patient perspectives and patient experience in all of this evidence development process, whether it's clinical trials or real-world evidence. Just to stick with the real-world evidence side, a lot of the work that Sentinel's done so far that's already been discussed, and a lot of the potential, Bill, Jeff, and Pam, that you're alluding to involves using things like insurance claims data on utilization, electronic medical record data on the clinical status of patients. But if we look around us today in 2015, that really the most notable shift in information evidence that people are developing and using in their real lives is information coming from people themselves, their own, in this case, it'd be their own clinical experiences, their quality of life, as Bill was saying earlier, how the benefit-risk prediction really amounts to a reality. For an individual patient, it's not a prediction, it's a reality. It's one or the other, and the clinical outcome measures may correlate well with what matters to the patient, but they certainly don't always capture it. So I'd like to talk a little bit about where you all see the role of patient experience and perspectives going forward in these issues related to clinical trials and real-world evidence. Maybe one place to start on this is the data and endpoints that are collected. So FDA has recently had some approvals and labeling changes based not on what might be considered hard clinical endpoints by doctors, but on quality of life measures from patients. But this is still only a small minority of the endpoints in clinical trials. I think only a limited number of trials conducted in the last few years for product registration have involved patient-reported outcomes. Is that going to change, and should it, and how fast?
I think it can change. We've seen initiatives that demonstrate that this is not impossible to generate this data. At least, and people volunteer this data all the time through the use of now common websites and things like Patients Like Me, where you can aggregate the experience of patients on a variety of different treatments, or even just with a variety of different diseases, to try and understand how diseases or interventions are impacting the daily lives of the people that are dealing with it. I think maybe the difference here is that a lot of attention on PROs is often placed on how it can contribute to the pre-market aspect of the product. And that is, adds to some of the complexity. I think historically, endpoints that have been used, at least in oncology, are how a drug affects a disease, and it doesn't necessarily reflect how the drug affects the person, so to speak. And those are sometimes easier to measure. It's comparatively easy to understand if a tumor is shrinking because of the result of taking a treatment. But like you said, the instances where a primary endpoint being what a patient reports happening to them, the examples are pretty few and far between. And I think we do need to think about how patient-reported outcomes or patient experiences can complement some of the traditional measures for drug efficacy in terms of the pre-market space. But then there's this whole post-market space that I think there's a growing interest, and organizations that have a huge reach to different patient constituencies that are interested in understanding what their constituents, what's happening to the constituents by using different therapeutic interventions. And there have been some great steps taken forward in terms of policy. Within the last FDA reauthorization, there was the establishment of a patient-focused drug development program, which provided the resources and set up the infrastructure for the FDA to conduct. They're in the midst of 20 different meetings to solicit information directly from patients and patient advocates about the experience with diseases and potential interventions. And the goal is to help aggregate that information and add it to regulatory decision making. I think moving forward, there could be opportunities at looking at providing guidance into methodologies that different organizations could employ when working with their constituents to make sure that the information that's brought back to researchers or to the FDA is scientifically rigorous enough to be able to be used for regulatory purposes. I think most organizations that provide direct services to patients are there because they provide very important services. They're not necessarily set up to be research engines, but they have the data. So, it goes back to collaboration in terms of trying to align what the needs are for different stakeholders, but certainly organizations that are conducting giving services to patients, and where there's interest to better understand how they can improve the lives of the patients that they represent. Having the methodological guidance on how to generate this patient experience data better would go a long way to advancing the field.
I think there's actually, Jeff is exactly right. There's a couple of things that people need to think of when they talk about patient engagement. I think, first of all, the definition of what it is a big deal. And I think that there's always a collective sigh if people start talking about, let's define what we mean. But what we don't have the methodology to turn those patient stories quite yet into some sort of a science that can be objectively used. And I think creating that science would be fantastic. There are groups working on that. MDIC, the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, has a project on it and has done some really good work. And it'd be good that we don't always reinvent the wheel, because we're very good at that too. We try to think always that we're very special. Every disease is special, and every group is special. But really, there's a lot of commonalities. So to just sort of think of that. But then the other piece is to sort of how to best engage with patient groups and how to best engage with patients. And there really aren't any best practices about that either. Like, what are the groups to engage with? How do you set that up in a way that's right, legally and ethically, and those kind of things. And we're coming up with best practices for that, and they'll be out soon. But I think that's been something that's missing too. It's not only the science of how to turn these stories into something you can use in the drug development space, but then how to actually engage with the patient, and what does that look like? How can you best do that?
So I agree with Jeff and Pam that there is a great need and desire to focus on patients. We're all here to meet the needs of patients. Unfortunately, it's easier said than done. And so we agree that in the area of patient-focused drug discovery and development, there is the need to understand what the science of patient input is all about. I think we all believe that there is a science involved here, and that whether it's in social sciences or some other areas, how do you bring to bear what is beginning to be learned about patient desires, inputs, behavior, et cetera, and to be able to, as you say, Pam, develop the tools and standards to be able to objectively put this information in place and to use it post-market, yeah, but pre-market, as you pointed out, Jeff, in terms of identifying new endpoints, new study designs, or later in the process of actually using this information for regulatory decision making. I really do believe that those workshops that the FDA began a couple of years back have been terrific. One example as a physician, occasionally have seen patients with sickle cell anemia, and I've thought all about pain and a lot of features that are traditionally sort of looked at in these patients. But one thing that came out in one of these workshops is to understand that fatigue is a tremendous factor, and it's somehow lost or not fully captured. So how can we together understand better what that science is all about? How do we apply it to the ways that I've talked about? And also, we might have time to talk about this, Mark, but link it with drug development tools such as biomarkers. We think of patient-focused drug development as also PROs, patient-reported outcomes, patient-centered outcomes, because we believe it's not just about patient reporting, but what about family? What about healthcare providers? They also provide very important information. So how can we put this all together to make the whole package of what our endpoints are really, in the end, meaningful to what counts the most, which are our patients?
So did you have a...
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we believe that patients have a role in every step of development of treatments, not just drugs. It really also, it's not only the endpoints and the outcomes, but the question. Ask a question that matters to everybody, not just to the companies, but to the patients. And then if you ask a question that matters and have inclusion criteria that are relevant and target the population at need, and have endpoints that matter, and hopefully in the end a treatment that makes something better, you won't have problems as much with enrollment of patients. Patients will want to be in your trials because it matters to them. Now sometimes there are trials where patients go, God, I'd rather be in this trial. This one doesn't interest me. It's not relevant. So I think...
Pam, are you starting to see some best practices for having active patients involved, not just involvement, but I guess leadership in every stage
in the drug development process, not just in the endpoints, not just in the traditional, we come to you because we need help with enrollment. It's really the whole process. I think in that may be the sentinel change that we need to see, is to really make it worthwhile for the people that in the end it's made for.
Very interesting. I would like to, I'm going to turn to questions from the audience in a minute, but I just wanted to follow up on one thing, one theme that seems to be emerging across all of these areas where, whether it's patient engagement and participation, or new methods for designing and conducting clinical trials, or dealing with some of these thorny issues around methods for using real-world evidence effectively and appropriately. This stuff is hard, and as you all have noted, there's a lot of activity going on. There's been past legislation that's urged FDA or directed or mandated FDA to take more steps in this direction. Jeff, you mentioned, for example, around patient-reported outcomes, these steps to engage patient groups. FDA has also been directed and is taking a lot of effort on its own to be clear about benefit-risk methods and frameworks in particular disease areas. But this is hard work, and while FDA is really good at holding meetings, especially when Congress tells them to do so, and the staff there are trying hard to keep up with everything that's going on in these fields, it's very limited resources for some very big problems. And I wonder if that's what's behind what seems like a big theme in many of the legislative proposals that are being discussed now in this whole area of biomedical innovation, and that's more public-private collaboration. So whether it's around patient-reported outcomes or biomarker collaboration or methods for study design, you can find something in the help committee list or in some of the topics that the Energy and Commerce Committee has worked on that lay out some role for a kind of public-private collaboration around addressing these issues. Now, this seems like an area where there's some progress going on, clearly a lot of activity that you all have emphasized, but it's also an area that makes many people nervous, that you've got the FDA working too closely with perhaps with industry, with patient groups that also work closely or get support from industry. Are there best practices for doing this? You all have been involved in a lot of these collaborations. Are there some more general lessons going forward, since this does seem to be such a hallmark of many of the proposals that are being considered right now?
Well, some have cynically said that the reason why there's more interest in public-private partnerships is that we're out of solutions, and the only way to do this is to try to work together. In truth, the matter is, I think, Pam, you've said it, is that many of the issues we face are indeed complex, and the only way to sort of really approach it is probably to be sure that you have multiple perspectives of the same problem and try to attack them. I think no one sort of would argue that these kinds of things are important and can be very useful, and we can provide some examples. There is something that continues to sort of limit what we do, and that's human nature. When you bring all these groups together, there's always the different perspectives, but sort of a desire to own the process. How do we sort of diffuse that? How do we align the goals of everybody in a partnership? I think that's also been challenging. When you bring in industry, you bring in other groups, there's always the challenge of if there's a new idea, who owns it, et cetera. One example, if Pam McInnes were well in here, we'd probably talk about the Accelerated Medicines Partnership. This is something that, excuse me, Francis Collins initiated with a number of groups, industry, but also very importantly, patient advocacy groups, to focus on a number of diseases, but work together to define new targets, the starting points for new medicines. This had never been done before, and I sit on the executive steering committee and watch the progress here. It's really phenomenal what's happening. The fruit still is not for public consumption just yet, because there still needs to be more progress made, but it's impressive how these companies working together with NIH and also academics and patient advocacy groups really, I think, will lead to something very useful. It's very much akin to what might happen in precision medicine and the like.
I think public-private partnerships have a great role to play in this. What we need to think about, though, is they take a while to launch and to sort of get into a groove. I don't know if that was the same. Yeah. People need to learn to trust each other. Trust is a big thing in these public-private partnerships, because if you don't have the trust that people are there for the greater good, it's kind of like, who owns it? Really, nobody owns it. Everyone owns it, right? Not one individual owns the solution, and that's really how it should be. It's really for the public good that we're doing this, to try to make these better. And I think if you have trust, then you can have the hard discussions. There's always some questions sometimes about like, is it ethical to have all these people in the room, so to speak? But if you have everyone in the room, then really everyone, it drowns out the sort of somebody having more say than another, so it kind of equalizes the playing field. And I think having these discussions and having the trust where you can say the things that are really the barriers of changing something is the only way that you can create a solution around it. It's one of those Greenpeace slogans, right? If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem a little bit. So that's really what, in a public-private partnership, you can address. Because then the problems can be put in the room, and it's the power of everyone thinking and everybody bringing their perspective that will get us solutions, is what I think.
I think that the important thing to stress about the emphasis on public-private partnerships is that it's bringing together critical expertise. Right. It's not about, or it shouldn't be about, simply replacing resources. You know, I think oftentimes it's the private sector is leaned upon to contribute more and more and more. But from a policy standpoint, if those responsible for making funding decisions are not willing to provide the investments for organizations like NIH and FDA to have increased resources, then they simply won't be able to participate in these. You know, there's not a replacement mechanism. But you know, in terms of checks and balances, I agree with Pam, they exist, and by bringing everyone together, that will naturally sort itself out. Yeah. And by not doing so is essentially saying that the current environment and the status quo is acceptable, which I think we're all here to say it's not, and we can do better.
Thanks. So we've had a lot of ground to cover with this panel, and thank you for covering all that ground. We do have a few minutes for questions and from the audience, so if we get the microphones up here, I'll start right over there.
Thank you for quite a tour de force. One of the things that I find interesting that I didn't hear much about is the shifting definition of health from absence of disease to optimizing health. And it strikes me that the question that people really want answered is, how do I never get sick? And a lot of the tools that we're getting and sensors and citizen science type activities, which don't traditionally fall into the quote unquote medicine space, actually have really made strides in the last couple of years that could offer a lot more structured understanding of what health is. But I'm wondering how you think about that in the scale of biomedical innovation, because as a former researcher, I definitely put that in there. But this discussion's been more about the treating disease after it happens.
Well, we could say a lot about that. Clearly, it's a very important point, and there are many investigators and groups out there really very interested in understanding what leads to healthier living, longer life. And there are certainly many stories of folks who've studied those healthy aging individuals who reach 100 and understand what is it that, whether it's genetic, environmental, that sort of helped in this. I think it's important. They're probably genes. They're not only cause disease, but to keep you healthy. So how do we understand more about those and help promote the activities of those genes, shall we say, and not only attack those that actually cause disease. So there's a lot of activity there. You'll see more and more as we go along.
Next question back here.
Great. Thanks to Brookings for organizing this event and to a great panel and set of comments. The question I had is, all these initiatives are really exciting. I'm a big fan of the large, simple trials, the adaptive designs, the building quality by design. All that is wonderful, but as Mark pointed out, it's really hard because it's about changing behaviors across. And the issue I didn't hear a lot about in this panel are incentives. I'm a big believer, particularly when you have to have that kind of behavioral change across. The challenge seems that in many of these areas, expense and the time and sponsor to do that is not precedent driven, involves some risk, is really difficult. Or the FDA obviously has a regulatory. Many of the institutional players, whether they're IRBs or others, have incentives. In this process, is it patient groups? And then you can see why on some cancers you really have seen that driven that way. Or is it just a reimbursement problem? At the end of the day, that will have a relatively cost-intensive clinical development model. Maybe if that were different, you would see.
Good question. Jeff, do you mind turning to you first? Because I think unquestionably in many of these areas, pressure from patient groups has made a big difference. And I've heard people say, well, if you could clone Ellen Siegel, for example, in other disease areas, we'd see more movement towards getting these collaborative efforts together. But that's a hard thing to replicate.
It is a hard thing to replicate. But I think it's true. There does need to be that driving force to point out, really at the end of the day, what is the ultimate goal? And it does take people to, it requires people to kind of rise above the challenges that they acknowledge within their own space of some of these partnerships. And sometimes it's harder than others. But that's why I think going in to any large-scale initiative like this, everybody has to agree, one, we're going to do business differently, but also what the goal is. And if you can keep focused on the goal, then in many cases, some of the hard decisions that are underneath that can be taken care of. of course, resources and reimbursement, is an issue. I think one thing that we maybe didn't stress enough in the discussion today is that the more complex you make a study, the harder it is to actually conduct. And, the reality is, what we're talking about, at least in the community health setting, is, patients that are, on single digits of minutes that they spend with a patient. And that makes it very difficult to explain a complex study or implement a complex study into regular practice. Frankly, we've seen this from the lung map study, that there are some complexities to this that have made it more difficult for some research practices to implement a study like that. Some of it may indeed be resources, maybe not just on single patient reimbursement, but even from a staff perspective of having people with the expertise and the time to implement a large-scale study. And this will happen with multiple endpoints. The more you add into the data collected, the more complex it becomes. So yes, finances is a part of that, but there also has to be the willingness to change behavior across the board and expect that people can do things differently if we really want to achieve different goals.
So coupling that change in behavior, and that's something where patient advocates and leadership can make a difference. Coupled with that, though, is the incentives. So incentives can maybe go in two ways. There's getting the benefits up and there's getting the costs down. There have been proposals around providing incentives to participate in research, everything from patent extensions to maybe subsidies or programs like coverage with evidence development in different payer programs, Medicare and elsewhere. But there also have been some good ideas about getting the cost down, making it easier for patients to participate in either real-world studies or clinical studies, reducing the cost of clinical trials, as you all have emphasized. Since Jeff, I've already picked on you. Pam, Bill, anything to add on most important steps to improve incentives by getting benefits up or costs down?
I think there's almost, at the moment, the incentive that it's not possible to continue the way we are. So we have to look at things differently. And I think everyone is very aware of that, which is why people have come to initiatives such as City and work with Friends of Cancer Research, because we have to find other ways of doing things. So it's almost the reserve incentive that's in place that can't continue like this, got to figure something different out. And then the other thing is there are other ways to make things cheaper. We haven't talked about the use of technology or anything like that, but I think those are also things we're looking at. Yeah.
Really not much to add. I do like the way Pam framed it. I think what we have right now from the medicine's discovery and development perspective is unsustainable. You'll hear in the next panel and remind us that it costs even more in order to produce one medicine if you count all the failures, so to speak, in this process. The failures is not an admission that the industry is not good or the whole system's not good. It's just that that's inherent in a system where we don't know everything. Okay, so in terms of incentives, I think this is something that I believe is the key to everything. But the sort of the reverse incentive, we've got to do something or else the whole system will break down, is a very important one. But investment in innovation is costly. And so there's got to be a way of being able to, at the same time, being more effective in finding the better targets for patients' needs, but also to think about whether it's clinical trials, figuring out how together we can figure out better targets to all pursue, and maybe not all pursue them independently. And think of the duplication and the cost involved in that, which in the past was considered to be competitive advantage, but maybe in the end of the day, it's not anymore.
Well, I want to thank you, Bill, for all of you for the answers, but Bill for giving me my transition to the next panel. You're right, they are going to be talking about some of the numbers that go along with many of the important issues that we've discussed on this panel, so you have a chance to get a more quantitative perspective of just how can we go about getting to more definitive evidence on what's working and what's not to address the biomedical innovation challenges that we've talked about here on this panel. But for right now, I'd really like to thank all of you for your efforts to frame this discussion today. Thank you all very much. And next, I'd like to ask the next panel to come on up to the stage.